Thank you for joining us today. I would like to introduce our speaker, and I will invite Alejandro also to share a little bit about himself. But for the recording, some more formal introduction. Dr. Alejandro Olayo-Méndez is an assistant professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. He earned his PhD from the University of Oxford, and his specialization is in humanitarian aid, migration, refugee issues, social justice, and inequality. His book, Humanitarianism from Below, that was published by New York University Press in 2025, so that's a very recent publication, explores how migrant shelters and faith-based organizations shape migration in Latin America and even beyond. He also led a Jesuit network with migrants projects studying integration and support for refugees across 14 countries. Outside his academic work, maybe that's not that correct to say, but Alejandro is also a Jesuit Catholic priest. So that's great. That's really an event that we have such a speaker today with us, and it's my honor to invite you to the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity to share with you the thoughts about my reflections about my own work, about of course the book was just published in August, made available in August. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about something that I'm very passionate and can help us to understand a little bit of the migration patterns in Mexico. One of the things that probably it's important to say, let me share the presentation and then I can start sharing. One of the things that it's important to share here, the book is really an ethnographic exploration of humanitarian assistance in Mexico. That means that I spent probably 2 years working over there in the migrant shelters. I was doing participant observation, so I was truly immersed in the field. You will see at some point one of the maps that I will show you. If there's nowadays there are more than 150 organizations, many of them faith-based, not all of them, but many of them faith-based, that provide assistance to migrants in different capacities. I think I stay at least 2 weeks in 50 of them. And I have 3 long stays at 3 of them in the kind of like the Gulf part of the country, kind of like that route. I chose the Gulf of Mexico because there was already some research coming out of migrant shelters who were on the Pacific side of the country, on the west part of the country. So in an effort to provide more evidence and to contribute to the literature from other field sites, that's why I chose kind of like the longer stays on the other part of the country. I will say a little bit of what is kind of like the approach of Casas de Migrantes. I will talk a little bit about the humanitarian architecture of Mexico, and I will devote the latter part of the presentation to talk about the faith element on this thing. And in a way, I will say the Mexican case is very particular in terms of faith, and I will say why. I think there's a chapter in the book that I call fertile ground, because it's a combination of things, the history of the country, the faith of the people, that create or facilitate the emergence of a network, and it's a loose network of a group of organizations that provide assistance to migrants and refugees. So that's more or less the background to understand this presentation. What are casas de migrantes or migrant shelters? Casas de migrantes are albergues para migrantes, comedores para migrantes. It's something that we call migrant shelters or simply shelters in a way. So these are places, and this is the most important thing, local organizations, formal and informal, that provide humanitarian aid to migrants, deportees, asylum seekers, IDPs, and refugees in distress. So the population that they serve, it's a wide range of profiles. But above all, I have to say, the emphasis in local, it's very important because The migration patterns in Mexico have never been officially recognized as a migration crisis in the world. So it's not an official crisis. That's why in Mexico, and there are different political reasons because of that happens, that there's reasons of that. But that's why you don't have the full display of international humanitarian actors in Mexico. That's why you don't have Red Cross all over the place, or that's why you don't have UNHCR all over the place, setting up shelters, tending to people. All these international organizations often partner and provide ad hoc support to many of these organizations across the country. One of the things that we need to say is like they often support to migrants, what we saw migrants in distress along the migration routes in Mexico and border cities. But many of them have a faith-based nature. And I will talk a little bit later about what is the process, how they emerge. I will say that these migrant shelters or casas de migrantes have developed an uncanny ability to adjust their services to the changing profiles of migrants moving through or returning to Mexico. So change and adaptability, it's probably one of their biggest traits and one of their biggest, I would say, strengths, because the profiles of people change sometimes rapidly, and the needs change. And these are, in a way, local organizations are often the first responders. They are the ones who respond because they are the ones facing the reality. So that's why you have this range of profiles: migrants, deportees, asylum seekers, IDPs. You have all these different profiles. So there's a lot of kind of legal profiles, legal statuses that play out. Casas de Migrantes vary in size, infrastructure, services, and internal regulation. So at some point, if someone wants to say, okay, what would be the model of a good migrant shelter? It's very difficult to say this is the best model or there's only one model to have a migrant shelter. I think through the year, well, that's because geography matters. So it matters where they are located, even if Mexico is a big country. So it matters if you are situated in southern Mexico, in central Mexico, in the north. It really matters. So geography matters, but also it's the culture of those regions that matter too. Also, that influence or that is related to the stage of the migration process. It's not the same that you are a migrant is in the south trying to reach the border with the United States and Mexico than a migrant that is already at the border between Mexico and the United States. They have different needs, they have different approaches, and they have different circumstances. So that's why it's very difficult to have a model for a migrant shelter. One thing that they have done in the past, these organizations, they share kind of like best practices. But again, I will say that best practices sometimes do not work exactly in or don't apply exactly at all the different stages or different places where they are located. In practice, these casas de migrantes, these migrant shelters, work as something that I call brokers of aid, because they do not own all the resources. They are kind of like the brokers, and they are capable of convocating people and kind of like partnering with different people to really gather resources, or partnering sometimes with international organizations to gather resources and be able to provide services to migrants. They have emerged in a way as an informal welfare system in Mexico. Migrants depend on it, not exclusively, but depend heavily on them. And of course, they are all over the place. What kind of services do they provide? There's an author that I made an adaptation of this, but it's an adaptation of something that he wrote at some point in 2018. Migrant shelters offer services of what we call basic order, which is food, shelter, clothing, cleaning facilities, communication services, information regarding human rights, asylum, tips for the journey, and spiritual support. Sometimes this is kind of like the spiritual support and the spiritual accompaniment is the thing that is kind of like left at the very and or kind of like it's, oh yes, we are faith-based, but we don't do kind of like too much of proselytism or run faith services. But it's interesting that many of them are faith-based, and they also kind of like try to provide this spiritual support to people. Um, there are services of secondary order. Sometimes they will have medical services, judicial services, reception of cash transfers, connections with government authorities to facilitate returns or to find support in the emergency. And they will have services what we call the third order, formal workshops on different topics, legal representation, and advocacy at different levels. These are not, it's not that some shelters provide only basic order or provide basic and secondary order, or they only do third order. These kind of orders is kind of like a typology that help us to understand the services in migrant shelters, but you can find a migrant shelter that provides basic orders and is very good about doing advocacy. Or you find that some of these services are kind of like offer ad hoc in different places. So just be mindful of that, that this is just a typology to understand their work. This is a map of migrant shelters until 2005. I think that the first shelter that has been documented, and I want to say this is important. Migrant shelters, as such, are kind of like the official entity. Probably many of these groups that open places to provide services, they have already existed before they start to function as a migrant shelter. As I said, they are the local communities are the first responders. So often groups are already providing services in a very informal way until they reach a threshold. It's difficult to say what is the threshold when they decide really we need to start to provide services in a more formal way. So often it's women organizing the community, and often it's women who push the pastor, the priest, or the evangelical leader to say, we need to open the church and do something. We need to open the church and let these migrants live here or do something. So the first shelter was opened here in this city, in this corner, in Tijuana. That's 1987. That is, as far as I did archival research, that's the year when the first shelter is open. As I said, insist, the first shelter formally. Why? What is happening there? That's the years in which crossing to the United States is becoming more difficult. The border between Mexico and the US always has been very permeable. So people were coming back and forth very easily, mostly Mexicans. At some point, it becomes more difficult to cross to the United States in the late 80s. And then migrants have to wait until it's an appropriate time to, to cross. Or they are returned and they don't have anywhere to stay. So the bishop, the Catholic bishop of Tijuana, asked the Scalabrini fathers. The Scalabrinians are a religious order, Catholic religious order that specializes in serving migrants. So they opened the first shelter in this corner, 1987, and they are still operating nowadays. They have different projects, different kind of work. So you can see, but you can see how in 2005, the migrant shelters, most of them are located at the border between Mexico and the US, because still at that time is where migrants are staying. You start to see some of the shelters here in certain parts of the country, but the big concentration is over there at the border. This is 2009. So you can see that the numbers have increased. And it's interesting that these changes or these places appear or are dictated by the train. I don't have the map, but it's the train track cargo train routes, which migrants ride on top of those cargo trains, and then migrant shelters emerge around these areas. One of the things that is important to say that some of these shelters disappear depending on sources, funding, and different circumstances. So this is 2009. This is 2012. You can see that there's an increase here in the center. It's interesting because these increasing in numbers of migrant shelters also involve changes in the migration patterns. There's a bigger number of people crossing. The journeys are becoming elongated, but the vulnerability is increased. So you start to see different places here. This is 2017. So you can see some of the red dot, you can see that there's now, you have probably in 2017, you have 80 something migrant shelters. Of course, there's still a big concentration in the north. You have here in central Mexico, another part, and the south. And the areas that are empty, they are empty for different reasons. It's about geography. Here you have the mountains, it's a mountain range. So the cargo train runs directly from central Mexico all the way, not along the coast, but along on the other side of the mountain range. And what you have here is kind of like a desertic place, desertic area. Also, this part is kind of like desertic, so there's no too much work. And here you can see another mountain range around here that divides in a way southern Mexico from central Mexico. So migration, geography matters. Geography matters in many of these cases. So the red dots that you will see are places that were open at some point and they closed. I think it's interesting because it shows kind of like the dynamism that exists in these shelters. And these are the migrant shelters until 2020. Um, these maps appear on the book, so I think it's just interesting to see that now you have many shelters along the border. Of course, Tijuana, it's a big, the corner is a big place, but you still have a lot of places everywhere providing services to migrants. The challenge nowadays is really to define what is a migrant shelter. How do we define it? Because that will determine what kind of who qualifies to, in a way, to be in this map or not. I have my criteria, so that's why it's limited. But I would say places or organizations that provide, some places or some organizations that still provide good services and a lot of services to migrants do not appear, may not appear in this map. So it's not restrictive. It's just what I was able to document. This is an example. This is a map that was created by one of the research centers in Tijuana. They map, this is the city of a map of the city of Tijuana. They map 90 organizations providing assistance to migrants in the city. 90. That means that we have difficulties of saying what is a migrant shelter, what are the qualities. So I bring this up because it's important to say how even the definition of what a casa de migrante or migrant shelter is has been expanded, and other actors have entered into play to kind of like talk about these things. So this is a little bit about the history. These are some of the pictures that you will find of migrant shelters and soup kitchens. This is the migrant shelters, and you will find, well, this is the migrant shelter here. This is the migrant shelter in Tijuana, the first one. It has evolved, of course, through the years, more than 40 years. And you have these faith elements. For example, here you have the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. This is a migrant shelter in the city of, this is also in Tijuana. This is in Ciudad Juarez, a soup kitchen that is run out of the cathedral. This is in San Luis Potosí. They are providing services. This is a group of women in Veracruz. This is in southern Mexico. This is in central Mexico. This is in Reynosa, close to Brownsville. This is the kind of food that they provide. This is a soup kitchen in Nogales at the border. This is in central Mexico, just outside of the shelter. So you find different sizes organizations along the road. Probably this shelter here, this is in Coatzacoalcos in the state of Veracruz along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. I often stayed at most shelters when I was doing research. I didn't stay at this shelter because I didn't feel safe. I thought it was kind of like a little bit, the neighborhood was very rough. So I didn't stay there because of Salem. This is not the safest place. So, but migrants, I have the luxury as a researcher to go and find other place to stay. Migrants may not have that luxury. And some of the shelters are very limited. Some of the shelters have different regulations, like this shelter in Tabasco, in southern Mexico, sorry, in Chiapas, in Palenque. Migrants enter the shelter at 6 p.m. and they leave the shelter at 7 after breakfast, probably 8 p.m., 8 a.m. Why? Because the sisters that run that shelter, they say like, It's a way to help them to make the decision to continue moving. Rather than staying for a long period of time at the shelter, they want them to keep moving. So these are just some images that you will find, different kind of populations, the Hondurans, maps that are along the trails that show where are casas de migrantes, what are the routes, LGBTQ people. So you have these different range of people that come to the shelters, different services, but that's what the reality looks like. Now, I developed this notion in the book of humanitarianism from below. I think this notion of humanitarianism from below dialogues now with what we call volunteer humanitarianism, that there's a branch of literature that has emerged from all the volunteers that have gone to Lampedusa, that have gone to Lesbos, and all the Greek islands that receive migrants there. You have another strand of also not faith-based, but more like activist humanitarianism. But it is all these kind of like literatures that start to see migrants, how other people help migrants, and it comes from below. You will have other projects like host to host humanitarianism, refugee to refugee humanitarianism. Elena Fidian Quasmayed, she's a big advocate. Well, she works on that. Is a great advocate from that. But this idea of humanitarianism from below, I think is a distinct form of humanitarianism. If I propose that, is deeply humane because it's based of we see the other, we recognize the other that crosses our backyard or crosses our towns, and we want to support them. We want to help them. And I will say more about that element. It's local. I think that's very important. It contains formal or informal organizational structures. It could be a very simple soup kitchen or a group of women or people who toss food to the train tracks or have services for migrants passing. It is self-sustained. Not, they may not have all the resources, but they are capable of gathering some resources to provide services. It's adaptable and often has a faith-based affiliation. Why the faith-based element is important? Because many of these people belong to churches. Many of these people belong to religious groups. And religious groups, I'm talking about churches in the most ecclesial meaning of the word. Ecclesia meaning the community, the people, not the hierarchy, not the bishops, not the patriarchs. It's not a top-down process. It's really people that out of their faith experience, compelled by that, they say like, I'm seeing Christ in these people. I'm seeing the suffering Christ, and we need to do something to help them. It's out of that support. There's a beautiful story of one of these women. Let me show you the picture. This woman, I interviewed her. She is Norma Romero. She's the leader of a group called Las Patronas. And she has this beautiful image of why she did the work. She narrates that one night the cargo train passes through their town, literally divides the town in two. So passes one night they come knocking at their door. They say like, the knock was so hard that I have to get up. And someone said like, we need help. Someone got hurt on the train. She said, the only light that we have, it was our flashlights and the moon. And then she said, when we arrived to the train, I saw this black Christ descending from the top of the train. Why a black Christ? I mean, when you're a researcher and know those people, you can like know a little bit. There's a group of Honduran migrants who are of African descent, the Garifunas. They are black. If someone is wounded on top of a cargo train, the safest way to bring him down is truly to grab him by the arms, open him up, and then you put down the body, carrying him from the arms. So it's easy kind of like to imagine if you have that background or you're familiar with kind of like with Christ as a figure, if you are familiar with the Garifan group, it's easy to see, oh, why she saw a black Christ. Of course, it is her faith what allows her to say that's a black Christ. It's not a Garifuna. It's a black Christ, which I think speaks a lot about their faith. So she sees that my interpretation is it was a Garifuna migrant that was wounded, and they bring him, of course, covered in blood, so you can make all whatever you want of that image of the black Christ. But that's the experience. And she said, since then, I knew I wanted to help these people because I was seeing Christ in them. So this notion of humanitarianism from below is the result of immediate and present needs. It's a response, and it's responsive intervention that responds to a particular place and a particular time. They are truly brokers of aid. And here, brokerage is defined as the process of connecting actors in systems of social, economic, or political relations to facilitate access to valued resources. So it's about brokering. So these actors, the faith plays an important component, and in terms of facilitating resources, but it's a broker. They play a broker. They can have roles as mediator, facilitators, and financial gain is not a central feature. That's why in the literature, some strands of the literature of humanitarianism talk about the migration industry, and they put humanitarian interventions into an industry. I will say there's no industry here. There's no financial gain. These people are putting their lives, their time for free and trying to find resources because they believe that they are helping the other. This idea is essentially in understanding humanitarianism from below, where there's no financial gain for a moral gain, but a moral gain in the process of intermediation. So the faith I mentioned. There is no general agreement on how faith and religion are defined. We know that. We as scholars, we know that it's difficult depending where you kind of find your resources. I mean, religion in a way has been understood as uninstitutionalized systems of beliefs and practices concerning the supernatural realm. Faith, in a way, relates to the human trust or belief in a transcendent reality. This is if we want to separate these things. Other elements will see them as completely intertwined and not being able to dialogue without one another or to exist without the one another. But I will say, like in this case, it's both, but it's the faith element, this idea of the trust and the belief in the transcendent, what is present. The role of faith and faith-based nature, I think, is because of this faith-based relationship, mostly Catholic in this case, mostly Catholic, but not exclusively Catholic. Nowadays is evangelicals, Muslims, that are kind of providing support in different ways. But it's because of these faith ethics that these organizations are able to emerge. Why? Also because Mexico also has a long history of social movements. There's a period during the Reformation in which there was no official recognition of the church. So there was an underground church that was doing this kind of work for vulnerable populations. And it was the Christian, the Catholic associations who were kind of like providing these services. We have other examples of solidarity, like we have a very huge diaspora. Mexico has a great diaspora. So they try through the diaspora, they have different programs to support different communities. They call it hometown associations. So if you send remittances to the hometown association, let's say you send $1, the government will match that benefit and will provide, they call it 3 per 1. So it will be your dollar plus $3 more from the government to whatever project you are funding. So it's a way to support. But you have this history in Mexico. And also Mexico is a country of immigrants, people who have left. So often I found in the interviews that people were saying, why I was asking, why are you doing this thing? Well, my husband, my daughter, my son migrated, and I just want to make sure that if at some point he's hungry, someone will give him or give her something to eat. That's why I'm giving something to these people, because they are suffering, and it's a way in solidarity. So I think it's this history, of course, the religious history, the faith history, the history of social commitment in Mexico that is a fertile ground for these kind of organizations to emerge. And the last thing that probably I will say then, is because of their faith dimension. And here is when religion enters, the formal structures, the churches, those resources that they have are made available to migrants. It's very easy for a church to turn one multipurpose room at the parish or at the church to house migrants, to let them sleep. It's easier to build 2 bathrooms with showers in a patio or in an atrium to provide services. They have a captive audience, so if they need food, you can appeal to the community and say, hey, we need rice, we need feminine products, we need things for children. So it is this kind of like captive audience in a way that it will have a natural sense of empathy because of the Christian values of solidarity with the other, with the stranger, that you can appeal to, and then you can mobilize resources, communications, facilitate different things. So it's all these things around faith and around religion and resources are intertwined here. So that is part of the faith dimension. Now, one interesting thing has been happening. I will say, yes, there's the faith dimension, but these groups are also very careful of not letting the hierarchy to intervene too much. They don't want to lose the spirit, or sometimes they say, hey, we are doing good work, don't come and tell us what to do or how to do it because of political reasons. So there's migrant shelters have also adopted a secular identity. So they are faith-based, but they are also formal NGOs. And then they move what I call in a continuum of faith identity, in which sometimes they move more towards their secular identity because it's convenient for their work, or they move more to the faith identity to their work. The challenge there is like, especially, how do you, as more and more lay people, kind of like, or other people start to direct these kind of works, these kind of organizations, how do you keep the faith ethos alive in the organization? In the past, of course, there were the priests, the religious sisters, the pastors who were kind of like on top of that, who were kind of like fostering that, and they were in a way the presence of the church or the faith. As these leaders start to die, some of them, or they start to kind of take more in step in the background, and other figures start to emerge, how much do the faith identity in these organizations remain? I think it's a challenge. So this is the book. I mean, you can I have a lot of discussion on that, and why the role of faith, the role of the challenges. And there's another report that I have done on digital practices that include a little bit of why kind of like these organizations, these migrant shelters support the places. So I will stop there. I'm open for questions if people want to start the conversation. But thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Now we will have about like 30 minutes for a Q&A session. So we have already first question from Alexander Chernomorchenko. So I do have also some questions, but if we'll have time, I will leave them for the end of the discussion. So his question is about the Ukrainians. So I mentioned already about when the war started, there is a fact that many Ukrainians, they tried to go to the US through the Mexico. So the question is how many Ukrainians refugees applied to come to Mexico after 2022? So I don't know if this is the question about like the application to find a refuge in Mexico, or this is just they traveled through Mexico. And the second question, are there government migration policies in place? And I mean, I think that this is about those shelters maybe. And what programs did the churches do? Thank you.
Okay, regarding the question about the Ukrainians, you have to understand that migrants, we call them extracontinental migrants, or migrants that do not come necessarily from Latin America or South America. the destination is not Mexico. So even though we have some Ukrainians that apply for asylum in Mexico, I don't have the numbers, but those are easily, you access kind of like the website of Mexico, the foreign relationships, and you can find there how many. But the destination is not Mexico. Many of these Ukrainian, probably if I recall the numbers, probably they were like around 15,000, it's around the 10,000s that moved through Mexico or somehow made it to the border to the US and they crossed into the border to the US, requesting asylum into the US. So the destination is never Mexico. And that's kind of like a challenge because then you have a transit population that passes through the shelters. Now, as you know, in migration, the more resources you have, in better conditions you travel. So the migrants who use the shelters are probably the most, they are not the poorest, but they are not the ones who have the most resources. These are the migrants that use migrant shelters are the migrants that cannot pay $25,000 to go to the US, that cannot pay $7,000. So they are the ones who do not have the money, that really have to work in some places to make some money to continue the next journey and so on. So I think it's important just kind of like to be mindful of that. So that's more or less the number of Ukrainians, but it's they apply they arrive. We are very clear that they arrived to Tijuana, in that corner that we were showing you. That was kind of like one of the big numbers. But if I'm sure they arrived by plane, so they flew because they flew probably from Europe somehow all the way to Mexico City or one of the big cities, and then they moved from there to Tijuana. So if they received some support from Casas de Migrantes, it was over there in Tijuana already. So they didn't have, some may have, depending on the circumstances, may have to cross all Mexico, but many of them didn't. So the other thing, like in terms of government migration policies in place, the migration law, the immigration law in Mexico is very interesting because it has a human rights framework, which is decent. It's not perfect, but it's very decent in law, in paper. I would say the application of those immigration laws, it's a different story. It's a different chapter. I would say like an interesting element in the immigration law is, for example, there's a provision in which it says that migration authorities or police cannot conduct enforcement or raids within the shelters. So that means that you create really a sanctuary space, a de facto sanctuary space, because they cannot enter. I mean, the surroundings of those spaces at some point, it will be a different thing because they can detain migrants, they can remove them outside of those shelters. So that's an interesting caveat. I think the government has changed the stance through the years. Nowadays, they will have, I mean, from time to time, at some point, at some point they open 4 shelters, kind of like to house people, but migrants don't want to go there because often they would be encouraged. IOM will come to the shelters run by the federal government, and they will try to convince people to return to their places of origin. So to make a voluntary return, which is an interesting thing. So migrants are very savvy and they pick the places that are conducive to their needs and to their migration projects. So, well, what programs did the churches do? I will say many of these shelters are run, I mean, along the churches. They belong or they are attached to a church. That's a program that they have, and it's kind of like the program of social services to them. So, is
Yeah.
that
Yeah, thank you. I think that I can add only about the Ukrainians that it was a short time before the U4U program, like United for Ukraine program, was launched by the US government. So, but I don't know what the situation, because now for several years when the U4U was open for Ukrainians to come to the US, there were no problems for Ukrainians to come to the US. But now, when the program was suspended, I don't know what the situation will be in the future. So that's a thing. So about theology, we have a question from Alexander Negrov. Alexander is our research fellow at our institute. So the question is, thank you for your presentation first. From your research interviews, could you share which theological constructs or narratives have served as foundational for those who stepped forward to assume social responsibility, demonstrating what might be described as leadership from below?
Thank you for the question. I think it's an interesting question. I have to say, the book is not a theology book. It's an interdisciplinary study more on the anthropological side and ethnography. It's more on the political side. I have a couple of elements there of theology, but it's not necessarily a theology book. But if you talk about the theological constructs of narratives, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the Good Samaritan, because the people recognizes is recognizing that if you want to add that a philosophical approach is this otherness, recognizing the other as someone who I can help. So you see, there's kind of like a theology of recognition. I see the other who is in need. In the words of Norma, it's the suffering Christ. I saw this Black Christ suffering that I needed to help him. So the theological constructs of what you can like describe as leadership from below is truly this notion of, in the case of migration, is like we see people in need, like the Good Samaritan, and then we act, we move forward, we come close to mend their needs. And sometimes that mending means it's a very physical thing, from healing blisters, punching blisters, and making healing, cooking food for people, making sure that they rest, making sure that they have their basic needs. It's a very interesting, but I will say if there's kind of like a narrative, it's recognizing the other. Is the other in need? And I feel compelled to do something because they are suffering. So it's there would be solidarity. The Good Samaritan comes in there, and it's just this notion of the suffering Christ, I will say so.
Thank you. I know that in your book you do not cover theological aspect, but I wanted to ask this question. Just I want to address it now because we started to speak about theology. What is the role of maybe theologians or theological schools in all those processes? Because you do speak about in your book about faith-based organizations or churches, but is any place for like more academics in those processes, or they do just research?
No, I think there's a place. The fact that these places belong, but yeah, okay. The fact that these places emerge, some of them attached to a church as a social project, or let me say this, the fact that these projects emerge first, and then as part of the community, so is this very sense of ecclesia, the community, that emerge out of faith, and then they push to say like, hey, the church needs to own this. This is what we're supposed to be doing. So you have this intertwined. So what is the role of theologians? I would say, first of all, the role of theologians is kind of to help us to reflect from a theology perspective. How can we approach migration from the lens of theology? My take from a theological standpoint is to say there's not one theology of migration. Migration, you can talk about theologies of migration, or I like to say which theological categories can help us to reflect on migration. Because migration itself, it's a very complex phenomenon that may sometimes involve forced migration, situations like war, or that you have experienced. So what a theology of mobility has to say about that, for example. Sometimes you have like the refugees. I mean, what can we say theologically about refugees? What can we say theologically about immigration? What can we say theologically about the process of return? What can we say theologically about the process of deportation? So there are many, many facets theologically that in migration that I think could be approached through different angles in theology. So there's not only one theology, but really the role is to help us to continue reflecting of why, from my perspective, opening like why we need to see migration not as a problem, but we need to see migration as something that is part of our lives, and how, from a theological point of view, we support, or we tend to say, like, when there are situations that attempt to the dignity of the person, we need to accompany migrants or be in solidarity with migrants and refugees. I will say that is the challenge, like how we stop seeing migration as a problem theologically, because I mean, like, theologically, you look at the Bible and different traditions, we are a people that have moved all the time. The people of Israel, the Christian experience, Jesus fleeing to Egypt, coming back. So you have, I mean, even if you want to kind of like make a very theological, there's an author, a Catholic author, that talks about this crossing the divide, that even the movement between crossing God that comes into the world is a movement of migration in a way, entering into the world. I mean, those things are, but this kind of experience on the ground, I think appeals in a different way to our sociological categories. What can we say from the experience from the ground theologically? Which there's, I think the prime example is truly being open to the stranger. How do we become better hosts when the stranger knocks at our door? So,
Maybe not theologically, but there is another question related from Christina Ola. Thank you for your reply first. Her question is, what do everyday Mexican people think about migration and migrants in their country? What does the national church communicate about it?
okay, a couple of things here. These groups are run by local people. So these are the Mexican people. So in a way, there's a part of the Mexican people that is friendly to and kind of like willing to support migrants in distress. So that gives you one side of the story. There's another side of the population that also preys on migrants, just like in any culture. I mean, like, go to the Bible and you find scribes and Pharisees abusing uh, poor people, charging outrageous taxes and so on. So you also have a sector of the Mexican population that can like um, preys on them. There's attention that see them as a threat, or they see them as an opportunity for business. I mean, the fact that there are kidnappings, that the fact that that there's rape, that there's violence against migrants, tells you that there are some sector of the people that are not too friendly to them, that they don't care about them. And those are also Mexican people. I think probably in a more kind of like larger thing, you start to see a trend as migrants have to stay longer in Mexico. Now there's more open complaints from the population that will say, oh, why are you helping these migrants when you don't tend to the needs that we have in our country? What you don't tend to the needs that we have among the poor people in this place, in our places. So you have also that sector. So it's, I would say, it's nowadays is both. You have a sector that is friendly and you have that is willing to support, and then you have another sector that is not willing to support. The national church, what does the national church communicate about it? I think like the national church here is big. I don't know the number of dioceses that they have in Mexico, but it's not minor. So you have a big conference of bishops. So it's difficult for them to have one single voice or one. So there would be some bishops that are more friendly, more outspoken. What is true is that at the national level, there's a kind of like within the conference of bishops, Mexican bishops, there is an office that deals with the pastoral needs of migrants, and they kind of like they get organized. I would say also you have to consider that sometimes bishops are, I mean, like the hierarchy is involved in politics, so sometimes they make decisions regarding the shelters or wanted to make decisions regarding the shelters that affect the operation, but that bishops want to keep it quiet, don't get too involved in advocacy because that's not our role. Um, but it's about politics. So we also have to own that part of as part of the role of the church.
Thank you for your answer. We have more and more questions. So we have two questions from Clement Kwame. I hope I pronounced that correctly, the name. So you speak about that. You speak about that in your book a lot, but his question, and you already covered it during your presentation, but still, maybe you'd like to add something. Please, in your perspective, how can Christendom, I mean, churches and denominational bodies, do to favorably contribute to make the lives of migrants comfortable as they transit from one place to another? So, and the second question is, in your perspective, what suggestions can you propose to limit and possibly end migration from one country to another?
Okay, the first one I will say, moving when you are poor, moving to another country when you are poor is never comfortable. It's never comfortable. I mean, these migrants walk, these migrants ride on cargo trains. So, but also you have to understand that many of these places that offer support are poor. They have limited resources. So when we talk about comfortable, we just need to be careful of what do we mean by comfortable. I would say their basic needs are met. A place to sleep. Sometimes it's with a mat on like a gymnastics mat on the floor. Sometimes if they have more resources, they will have beds. I mean, you saw some of the pictures, like the bunker beds or stuff like that, but it's so I will say it's by comfortable, I will say these organizations try to um, these organizations try to meet the basic needs of migrants in the best or to the best of their abilities. But these are people that also these are organizations that also have. I mean, you're not going to have salmon for breakfast, or you are not going to have a fancy meal. I mean, like you saw the meal, it's rice with beans and two tortillas because there's no more money to buy. So I would be just careful of why comfortable means, because I think their needs are met basically in the best way. And depending on the shelter and the resources the shelter has, some shelters may have better food than others. Some shelters have better facilities, but it is what it is. I mean, like it certainly they provide the spaces of safety. The other thing that the second question I think is more complicated. I think we need to go back to this idea. I don't think I can propose something to limit migration. I mean, while I'm not advocating for open borders, I think people have a right to move and find better livelihoods wherever they can. I mean, this idea of borders is really kind of like from Westphalia, and you are very kind of familiar with kind of like how the borders have shifted in Europe, for example, how borders change. So I wouldn't be surprised in 50 years we have moved more to blocks, economic blocks, without the boundaries. Once we kind of like normalize the fact that people move, we have moved for ages. The US is built with migrants. It's built on the back of migrants, waves of migrants, different people that come and go. I mean, the big experiment, I will say, is the European Union when you have borders, but you still keep the identities. Now you don't have borders. You have different blocks that facilitate among countries that facilitate the movement of people. So this idea that we're going to stop migration, I think it's a little bit ingenuous because we have moved and we will continue to moving. Now, it's only 3.7% of the global population that moves. Not everybody moves for different reasons. Of course, when you look at what 0.7% means in terms of the global population. It's a lot of people moving. And of course, it's concentrated in the places where have the best economies. But it's not, I think we need to kind of dispel the notion that, oh, migration, everybody's moving. No, not everybody's moving. And not even those that face forced migration or situations, war-like situations, move. So I will say it's not that we have to limit migration. I will say we need to foster dynamics, or we need to foster policies that make the movement in the most safest way. And it's accessible. Because, I mean, the US especially, the rhetoric is like, oh, we want them to come the legal way. But there's no legal way. There's no legal avenue to do it lawfully that is easy or that is not expensive. So I would say that I would go around those. Those would be my responses.
Yeah, I know that also this question was broadly covered by one of the experts on these questions about these questions of migration by the Hein de Haas, Dr. Hein de Haas. So I don't know if our participants know this name, but I've shared with them through our email. So I hope that we will have a chance to read some of his publication on this topic.
Yeah, his book, he has a book, a recent book, How Migration Works.
Yeah,
And
where
he
he dismantled myths around
the myths of migration. So, which is, I mean, like I work with Hein, I'm still working with Hein, so I know him well, I know well his work. So in a way, my comments are based on kind of like his building on his approaches.
Yeah, thank you. I want to use this chance and also to thank to Pavlos Mitsnuk, our colleague, our good friend from Notre Dame University, who introduced us to Alejandro. And this is how this lecture became possible. So Pavlo has a question too. So he asked you if you can tell us what the situation is in the shelters now, given the Donald Trump administration's immigration decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Pablo, for the introduction, and thank you for the question. Yes, I mean there have been changes. I would say once the migration policy, I mean, like before the second Trump administration started in January, migrant shelters, especially at the border, were packed. You have in Tijuana, there was a shelter that was housing 1,200 people. There were other shelters in Piedras Negras across Calexico um, that had 700 people at any given time waiting to use the CBP1 app to be able to access the US and ask for asylum. So once the Trump administration started, it's not that the border has been completely sealed. I mean, the government talks about, oh, it's sealed, that there's no movement. Well, they still have 10,000 detentions a month. That means that there's still certain movement. People try to cross. Of course, it's not the big numbers that they can like do, but it is important to understand that there's still movement. I would say there are three basic trends that you will see in terms of the movement, and then I will talk about the role of migrant shelters. So you have migrants who are returning to the places of origin. I will say it's a good number, but it's not overwhelmingly big. They have, I think, IOM and other organizations try to make it bigger, but there's a pattern of return with all that it entails. That's one thing. There's a pattern of relocation. So people who were at the border relocate to other Mexican cities, bigger Mexican cities that provide better um, better opportunities for livelihoods, jobs, housing that are less dangerous when people feel a little bit safer than rather waiting at the border. And then you have the places at the border. People at the border who don't know exactly what to do, often is women with children, women traveling along with children, that they don't know exactly what to do, what would the next step. So they remain at the border. Now, living in these conditions in these shelters, they have to come. It's not for long-term stays. People cannot live there forever. So people naturally start to leave those places and seek other opportunities outside of the shelter. So the shelters, I talk a lot about the ability to adapt. Now they are adapting one more time to become what I call community centers. So especially at the border, it's very clear that now there was one of my friends in Reynosa across McAllen, that they were saying, oh, now we have 34 families outside and we are providing services to them. So the services range from childcare, food pantry, a little bit of community centers, so these women who are often alone can connect, information, cash transfers. So you have all these different needs that are met by these organizations. In the bigger cities, the shelters in the bigger cities, they have started to function as hubs for jobs, like yeah, they try to find jobs and kind of for people, and so they become these things. So I would say, and in the south, probably where in southern Mexico, the legal services are more like at a prime, because migrants want to stay lawfully in Mexico. So I think you have these changes, but it's the ability to adapt and to morph to meet the needs of the people who are kind of like yeah, they are looking they see the people in need and they just adapt their services to the need.
Thank you for your response. So I have a question, quite a long one. This is the question from my friend Ricardo Piol, who joined us for this meeting. I know that he likes always to explain the context broadly and to the long questions, thoughtful questions. So his question is, the epochal scale of immigration we are experiencing and the sheer diversity of situation and migrants asking to be welcomed, not as a needy people, but as a human beings of infinite dignity, are revealing the impossibility of responding alone and with the individual's goodwill alone. In Italy, the country where I live, there is clearly a lack of popular awareness and a community dimension capable not only of responding to phenomenon as a whole and the uniqueness of each individual need, but also to the great question of the value of the faith in real everyday reality. How has the experience in Mexico you've told us changed or is changing the experience of community and faith of the people it involves and of the church?
I think it's a great question. Thank you. I wouldn't say that probably is the only example of solidarity that exists for migrants. I think in the secular world, I was talking about these strands of literature, volunteer humanitarianism, refugee host to host, that try to provide solidarity, and that were like even before. Well, probably the volunteer humanitarianism now, but the host to host refugee work has been there. I think like the humanitarian work in Mexico and Casas de Migrantes, in terms of faith, are one example that people want to be in solidarity with other people, that people recognize the need of the person because of their faith. They recognize Christ, they recognize the other as someone in need, not necessarily that needs to be rescued, but it's someone, there's a need that we have to meet. There's a need that needs us. So I think is one example of what does it mean to be a good Samaritan. If you ask me, I would push it. I know it sounds simple, but there's a lot of depth there. People want to be in solidarity with these people and meet their needs. And I think that echoes clearly and parallels perfectly the image of the Good Samaritan that goes out of the road to pick up the wounded man on the road and takes care of them at the expense of his own money. Whatever I owe you, while you take care of him, I will pay you on my way back. That's what the scripture says. So I would say the experience in Mexico is a good example of this. But I will say it has been a good example because other faith traditions have stepped up. I mean, nowadays it's not only the Catholic, the Christian tradition, it's the evangelical churches that started to say, okay, we also can do this. And I mean, like, there's another issue if they do it well or not, or how effective it is. There are other dynamics involved. But you see that, you see kind of like the Muslim community saying, we have different people with Muslim backgrounds. We can provide this space for them to meet not only their physical needs, but also their spiritual needs of a Muslim background, which I find, I mean, like, I was going to say fascinating, but I found very moving, because he's recognizing the need for God regardless of the tradition. And it's like we need to meet not only those needs, but we also need to meet these other needs, the spiritual needs of people. So, I mean, that's a long response, but that's probably what I will say.
Thank you. You started your lecture with mentioning about women and the question we have about women. So the question is from Julia Krimpenford. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. You mentioned the role of women in starting to offer help and pushing priests toward opening casas de migrantes. Do you go into more detail about that in your book? In those chapters that I have read, I didn't find a lot about that, so maybe there is something in other chapters.
I would say no. The answer is no, because the focus is on the humanitarian work. Nevertheless, I open the acknowledgements, the first paragraphs of the acknowledgement. I have all this list of women. I say something like, I've been always amazed by the amount of women and religious sisters offering services. And I say, I think this could be kind of like something that later it could provide an opportunity to do a research or an exploration of with a gendered approach to understand humanitarian assistance. Because the number, and I list the number of women, a number of women and religious sisters that I have met, volunteers, staff. I mean, honestly, women step up to the process, step up to the plate, and it's the women. But I mean, like, one thing that I always say is the women who sustain the church. You women are the ones who risk their lives to go to these remote places. You look in the churches and the ones running groups, supporting, sometimes cleaning. It's like, yes, you have the men kind of like doing all the hierarchical part, and I mean, there's a lot of issues there with the access and the leadership in the church. But if we look around, it's women who are kind of like doing a lot of the work. So it's not surprising that also in humanitarian work and in this kind of work in local communities, women step to the plate. They are the ones. So in the book, I don't go deep into that because it's not the angle that I took, but I recognize that as an opportunity that still needs to be explored. Why is it that there's more prevalence of women? And if you look around the humanitarian world, there are more women doing humanitarian work than men.
Thank you. Yeah, the book covers lots of different points on this issue. And I have a chance to read the second and the third chapters of this book, as I recommended also to our participants to find this book and to read those chapters. So I do really recommend to read this book. This is not my area of study, and the migration theologies are not the area of my study, but I enjoy reading this book and revealing, broadening my perspective on what is going on in Mexico and in the US too, because this book full of interviews, data, facts, stories, and there are a lot to learn from them. In Ukraine, what we do have now is when many faith-based local communities, they step forward first to provide some help to people who are going through really very difficult situations. And when all the processes with the kind of relief aid from the governments, they are very bureaucratic. it's hard to imagine the life of some people without support of a faith-based organization communities. Unfortunately, I do not think that we have such a broad study on the situation in Ukraine like that, but I hope that we'll have something in the future. So thank you, Dr. Alejandro Olayo-Méndez, for being with us today. Thank you for your time. I know
Maybe
that
just say,
schedule is very busy, but thank you.
I just
Yep.
want to say one more thing. Never forget that usually in crisis, the local communities and often faith-based communities are the first responders. They are the ones who first step onto the plate. I think that's probably something that is important. So, yeah. Thank you for the invitation.